That's Marta. She's already sitting here. Just a little bit of introduction to Marta. Marta is the co-director of the Academy for Systems Change, an outgrowth of the Donella Meadows Institute. And she also stewards, very importantly, the Donella Meadows Archive. As we're celebrating the 50th birthday of Limits to Growth, she will reflect on that and on the report that Dana Meadows also lead authored, which was a first instance, as you all know, of popularizing the concept of global biophysical limits and the implications of limits to growth thinking going forward. That, again, was sort of validated last year in a study by Gaia Harrington, who worked at KPMG at that time, and just make clear how accurate the projections of limits to growth actually were. And when we talk about limits to growth, that's very close to our work around thresholds and allocations, really making sure where we are able or where we are crossing capacities, boundaries. That is actually what limits to growth already showed us 50 years ago. So I'm inviting Marta to come on stage for her presentation and looking forward to that. Here's the clicker.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi. So I would like to start this presentation just with a realization that my body is shivering, and not just because it's a little cold in here, but actually because of the provocations and the intensity of the previous presentation. So I'm totally engaged, totally blown away, totally grateful to be here with you in person and online. So yes, I would like to spend a little bit of this time to actually look back a little bit to limits to growth as we celebrate or reflect actually on the 50th anniversary. And Donella Meadows was the lead author of this book, and so that also brings me back to circle to a passion of mine, which is actually drawing inspiration from the enlivening and hopeful work of Donella Meadows. So let's see if I can just go forward. What was Limits to Growth about? What was it? Well, if you see it, it's a tiny little book that was mostly, as I said, written by Donella Meadows, who had a very engaging style. And what was it about? It was really about us. It was about the fact that already, of course, 50 years ago, and still now, we were subject to exponential pressures of growth. Everything was growing. The population was growing, our impact on the environment was growing, the output of the industrial society that we had built was growing, pollution was growing. So this is all something that we know by now. But at the time, it was actually quite revolutionary to think that maybe, or hypothesize that maybe all those exponential pressures and dimensions are somewhat at odds with the finite capacity of the Earth. So that's what it is about. And 50 years later is actually a good time to reflect even on the concept of time. You know, Tariq was actually talking about urgency, the importance of this urgent work for the younger generations, and we are here 50 years later. There is something about decades that went by that somehow draws, kind of invites a reflection of what has happened and how does it feel 50 years later to actually look back and look at the meaning of this work. I would like, for the folks who have not had a chance to have actually this book in their hands, to share an experiential mini journey of 45 seconds in the book Limits to Growth. So for that, we have a video that really tries to distill, which I created a little bit kind of low-tech, that really goes back to the initial catalyzing questions. Sometimes they feel a little innocent or daring in a strange way. So let's watch this in 45 seconds. So they were asking very kind of common sense questions, right? Through this model, you saw at some point there was this very complex model. It was the first time there was a global model drawing from a very substantiated data to really investigate what's the fate of humanity growing in multiple directions exponentially on a finite planet. And they were really curious about what comes next. Okay, I think they had an intuition that you can grow these variables of extraction of non-renewable resources, grow the capital, grow population, grow the use of agriculture and land. And then what? What is the shape of our economic output, and what is the shape of the curve? And so they were really about that next point. What does it look like? And so you might recognize this slide, this image that it comes directly from Limits to Growth, the book, where you have this red line, and that's the 1972 publishing date, and where you have the bubble there, it's like where we are, and it's really that intersection of multiple curves hitting kind of that limit point, and then actually peaking through that limit point and seeing a sharp decline. And so what was interesting in the study was really that there was a robust feature in the model, or a characteristic, that the model would generate collapse. A very sharp, uncontrollable decline in all the variables, including human population and standards of living. And so to me, that is a moment of pause, because just reflecting that when I said robust, a robust feature of the model, that means that the young team of researchers from MIT, they were kind of turning the different knobs of the different variables, and they had to turn them quite significantly to actually avoid collapse in this model. And so that is a cause for pause, because collapse was actually intrinsically built in the industrial model that we had built over those decades. And so to me, it was also interesting that collapse was an unexamined, inevitable consequence of growth. And so, you can imagine that that is a quite troubling piece of truth. And so Limits to Growth was really about facing that truth, making it visible, and then it was mostly about choice. And so the question was, okay, will we be able to build a system, build an economic system fit for purpose, the purpose being really providing to the needs of everyone on Earth within the Earth's capacity, within the limits, within the thresholds? And even more importantly, will we choose a path like that? So it was really about choice. And so so you can see in the second diagram next to the first one, that actually there was a model run that produced stabilization. So collapse was actually avertible. And as someone mentioned before, actually I think it was Ralph, we are kind of loosely tracking the collapse track, and not really to the point, but roughly. And that's one piece that is very important to reflect upon. But being about choice, Limits to Growth was really opening our conversation. Whenever there is a choice, whenever we actually need to have the courage to look at truth and have the system see itself and reorganize to produce a more stable, kind of flattening the curve, I think was the language that Rick used, is a conversation that is value-based. And so that is really something that was very obvious when limits to growth came out, that it hit a nerve. It was a value-based conversation because it actually was not received in a way that was like, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and we should all kind of organize for collective action globally to actually flatten the curves. As you might know or might remember, the reaction was completely different, with scientists, heads of states actually kind of blocking from their consciousness this notion of limits in many ways. Some of it was language, some of it was really this deeply entrenched faith in technology. And in fact, there is a big piece on, in Limits to Growth about the mirage, if we want to use that language, of technology as a silver bullet. And so what does the Limits to Growth have to say about our current time? Why does it matter right now? Well, first of all, it matters because 50 years later, as we said, we are tracking loosely the collapse curves, and so that's a reason of concern, obviously. But also a reason of concern is that in most economic departments, and we're talking about young generation, this endless growth model type of economics is still taught today. I have colleagues, at the what was called the Gund Institute for Ecological Economics, and now it's called Gund Institute for the Environment, the University of Vermont, and we were, a small group actually trying to shift that model, and so that's part of my previous life. But what's very important here is that it's still being taught these days. And another, I think, aspect that is very important to reflect upon is that if you think about it, it was the first time that there was a big inconvenient truth that was exposed globally and collectively, and seeing the human mind and its limits. They were the limits. We were hitting the limits of the human mind and heart to actually embrace an inconvenient truth and do something with it. So it was obvious to Donella Meadows, to the team, that data and models were not enough to change mindsets, to change volition, to change decision-making. So over the course of decades, you might have seen that this team from MIT actually came back to this work 20 years later, and then 30 years later. It's not that they just published something and then I was like, oh, yeah, we told you. No, they stayed with that. They stayed the course. They stayed with that work. 20 years later, 30 years later, 40 years later. And then, luckily, other researchers are picking up that work and continuing to track the data. But Donella Meadows, to me, is essential in the way that she actually was able to transcend the scientific, the analytic. That was very important, and it stayed an important piece of her work. But she realized that actually we needed to engage people differently. And so she talked about 5 essential qualities for what she called a peaceful restructuring of a system that naturally resists its own transformation. And so she talked about visioning, truth-telling, networking, meaning making networks and cultivating them, learning and loving. Each of them is a subject of a different conversation, and actually I love any of these. But I would like to read to you what she thought about these qualities, because I think it's very relevant for this community that is actually very innovative and visionary. So she said, we introduced and discussed this list for the first time in our 1992 book, is Beyond the Limits. Our experience since then has affirmed that these 5 tools are not optional. They are essential characteristics for any society that hopes to survive over the long term. It seems like a feeble list, given the enormity of the changes required. But each of these exists within a web of positive loops. Thus, their persistent and consistent application, initially by a relatively small group of people, would have the potential to produce enormous change, even to challenge the present system, perhaps helping to produce a revolution. So I would like to conclude with a frame that I find very useful as I think of the work of change, and also to relate to the work, the rich and diverse work of Donella Meadows, which is available for the most part also on our archive, donellameadows.org. So I like this frame, which I actually have taken from Robert Fritz and modified a little bit. And so this idea of change being carried forward by recognizing the tension that there is between current reality and vision. Oftentimes, we might be thinking of change as, okay, recognizing, analyzing, being present to current reality in ways that, these important indicators that are being developed really kind of contribute to. And then it's kind of embrace a problem-solving attitude, which is very important. And yet, it kind of sometimes misses the creative part of how change comes about, which is engaging both the current reality and the vision and the pain in between. So one of the quotes that I like the most, and I'm not going to read, it's up there for you, is that talks about kind of acknowledging and enduring the pain that exists between current reality and vision. And Donella Meadows would do visioning exercise for anything, from studying a garden, studying a book, engaging in a global level hunger project. So visioning was a way of being, and so to me that it embodies an important quality of hers, which is a courageous curiosity of current reality, but then being able to kind of let go of the limitations, going beyond the limits, if you will, of the present reality, to actually being able to imagine beyond. And so I'll stop here with sharing a little bit more resources for you to explore about this work that continues to be hopeful and enlivening for me. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Amy. Thank you.